Skiing had always been our thing, me, Paul, and Nick. Every winter, we planned one big trip to a place that promised adventure, untouched powder, and a little bit of danger. This year was no different. We had our sights set on a remote mountain range that promised both beauty and solitude, far away from the crowded resorts. We'd heard about this place from some seasoned skiers. The trails were wild and unmarked, with no lifts and hardly any other skiers for miles. It wasn't an official resort, but that was part of the appeal, the kind of place where you felt like you were conquering nature, not following a preset path. The three of us had rented a cabin for the week, a small, rustic place with a wood stove and just enough space to sleep. It was deep in the wilderness, surrounded by towering pine trees and thick layers of snow that deadened any sound. The nearest town was a good hour's drive away. It was perfect. Just the mountain, our gear, and us. The first few days were incredible. We found fresh powder on every run, slicing through the snow as if we owned the mountain. The weather was cooperating. Clear skies, the sun glinting off the snow like shards of glass. Everything seemed perfect until the fourth day. That morning, the wind had picked up a little, clouds rolling in from the west, but it still felt like another good day to hit the slopes. We were pushing further up the mountain each day, exploring new areas we hadn't yet skied, and today was no different. Paul was the most adventurous, always scouting ahead, trying to find the best runs. I usually followed behind, while Nick, who was the most cautious of the three, hung back, making sure we weren't getting too reckless. We reached a new ridge that looked promising. A steep drop with wide open space below, perfect for carving out some clean lines. Paul was already at the edge, peering down. "This looks sick," he called back, his voice muffled by the wind. "I'm going to head down first." Nick and I watched as Paul took off, his skis cutting smoothly through the snow as he descended. For a moment, he looked perfect, disappearing into the distance with graceful, controlled turns. Then, just as he was nearing the bottom of the slope, he vanished. It happened so quickly that at first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. One moment Paul was there, and the next he was gone. No gradual fade, no stumble, just gone, like he'd fallen through the earth. "Paul!" I shouted, my heart immediately pounding in my chest. Nick was already moving toward the edge, his eyes wide with panic. "What the hell just happened?" "I don't know. He just disappeared." I pushed off, skiing toward where Paul had last been visible. The snow was soft and smooth. There hadn't been any sign of danger. But as I approached the area, I noticed something off. The snow here wasn't just powder. It was thinner, almost fragile, like a crust had formed over it. I slowed down, my instincts screaming at me to be careful. That's when I saw it. A dark, jagged gap in the snow, a crack that had been hidden beneath the thin layer, almost invisible from above. The drop was narrow but deep, disappearing into blackness. "Paul!" I shouted, my voice trembling as I peered over the edge. The walls of the crack were sheer ice, and I couldn't see the bottom. There was no response, just a howling wind. Nick skidded to a stop beside me, his face pale. "He's down there." "I think so," I muttered, my mind racing. We had to do something. Get him out. But how deep was it? Could he even hear us? We both had ropes in our packs, standard gear for this kind of terrain, but neither of us was an expert at crack rescue. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest, the realization that this was far beyond anything we had dealt with before. "We have to go down," I said, though the thought terrified me. Nick nodded, though his face was tense. He pulled out his phone to call for help, but after a few seconds of trying to get a signal, he shook his head. "No service out here." Of course there wasn't. We were miles from any cell tower, deep in the wilderness. We quickly set up the rope, securing it to a nearby tree. My hands were shaking as I clipped it to my harness, preparing to descend. I leaned over the edge and looked down again into the crack. It was a black void, so deep it seemed endless. A wave of nausea washed over me, but I pushed it aside. Paul was down there. He needed us. "I'll go first," I said, not giving myself time to hesitate. Slowly, I began lowering myself down into the crack. The temperature dropped sharply as I descended. The walls of ice were cold and slick against my gloves. The light above quickly dimmed as the narrow gap swallowed me. I could hear the sound of my breath echoing in the tight space, a harsh rasping sound that only added to the growing panic in my chest. I called Paul's name again, but still no answer. The deeper I went, the darker it became. I clicked on my headlamp, the weak beam of light illuminating the blue crystalline ice walls. They were rough and jagged, like frozen waves suspended in time. I kept going, trying not to think about how far I'd come or how far I still had to go. Suddenly, I felt a tug on the rope, a signal from Nick above. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I strained to listen. Was something wrong? Then, faintly, I heard it. The voice, far below me. It was weak, but it was Paul's voice. "Help!" The sound was faint, broken, as though it had been carried up from the depths of the earth. Relief flooded through me. "Paul, hang on. I'm coming." I quickened my descent, my heart pounding as I neared the bottom. The walls of the crack were closing in, narrowing until I finally reached a small ledge, barely wide enough to stand on. My headlamp swept over the ground, and there, crumpled in a heap at the very bottom of the crack, was Paul. He was alive, but barely. His body was twisted at an unnatural angle, his leg clearly broken. His face was pale and streaked with blood. His eyes flickered open as my light hit him, and he tried to speak, but the words came out in a garbled whisper. I dropped to my knees beside him, checking his pulse. It was weak but steady. He was shivering uncontrollably, his body already succumbing to the cold. We had to get him out fast. I pulled out a thermal blanket from my pack and wrapped it around him, trying to keep him warm. "I'm going to get you out of here," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I wasn't even sure how I was going to do that. The crack was too narrow to pull him up without risking further injury, and I didn't have the strength to lift him by myself. I shouted up to Nick, "I found him. He's hurt, but he's alive. We need to get help." There was a long pause, and then Nick's voice echoed down. "I'm going to try to hike back for a signal. It's going to take some time we didn't have." I looked at Paul again. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He wasn't going to make it if we didn't get him out soon. "Stay with me, man," I whispered, though I wasn't sure he could hear me. "We're going to get you out." But as I sat there, the cold seeping into my bones, I realized something wasn't right. The walls of the crack seemed to be closing in on us. The air was growing colder, heavier, and there was something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. A smell. It was faint, but distinct. The smell of decay, of something rotting deep within the ice. I shone my headlamp around the crack. The beam of light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. Something half buried in the ice, just a few feet away from where Paul lay. At first, I thought it was just a rock, a dark shape lodged in the ice. But as I looked closer, my heart stopped. It wasn't a rock. It was a hand. A human hand, frozen in the ice. The fingers twisted and blackened, the skin shriveled and frostbitten. I scrambled backward, my breath catching in my throat. My headlamp flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the crack. I stared at the frozen hand, my mind racing. How long had it been there? Who did it belong to? I shone my light further down, and that's when I saw the rest of it. The body encased in ice, its face contorted in a frozen scream, its eyes wide and lifeless. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping off the ledge. My heart was racing, my mind reeling. I looked down at Paul, still unconscious, then back at the frozen corpse. We weren't the first to fall into this crack, and we wouldn't be the last. Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in even tighter. The air grew colder, more oppressive. I felt a crushing weight on my chest. The sense that we were being watched, that something or someone was down here with us, buried deep within the ice. I looked up, but the narrow slit of daylight above seemed impossibly far away. The walls of the crack loomed over me, thick with ice and shadow, as if they were waiting to seal us in forever. Paul's breathing grew weaker. His body trembled violently. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that had taken hold of me, the overwhelming sense that we were not alone in this frozen tomb. But the smell of decay was stronger now, and I knew that we were trapped, just like the others who had fallen before us. The mountain had taken them, and now it was taking us. Our annual ski trip had always been a highlight of the year, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life and enjoy the serenity of the mountains. This year, we decided to try a new location, a remote resort that promised pristine slopes and untouched wilderness. The marketing material had boasted of a secluded paradise, but what we found was far from idyllic. The resort itself was charming in a rustic way, with cozy cabins and a few well-maintained trails. But the true allure was the promise of backcountry skiing on an old, abandoned ski lift that had been out of operation for years. It was said to offer an adrenaline rush and breathtaking views, and we were eager to test it out. The locals at the resort warned us that the lift was old and treacherous, but that only added to the appeal. We were seasoned skiers, confident in our abilities, and we shrugged off their concerns. On the second day of our trip, we set out early. The crisp morning air was invigorating as we made our way to the base of the old ski lift. The lift itself was a relic of the past, its wooden chairs rusting, and its cables hanging slack. The station at the top was a dilapidated structure, partially buried in snow and showing signs of severe weather damage. Still, we were undeterred. We approached the base of the lift, its metal supports creaking ominously in the wind. The surrounding landscape was beautiful in a stark, frozen way, with snow-covered peaks stretching out in every direction. We could see the trail leading up to the top, winding through the trees and disappearing into the misty distance. The air was filled with the faint, eerie groans of the old lift, as if it were protesting our intrusion. After a quick inspection, we decided to take our chances. The ascent was slow and shaky, the wooden chairs rattling beneath us as we climbed higher. The higher we went, the more the wind picked up, whipping snow into our faces and making the ride increasingly uncomfortable. But the view was stunning, with the world below a pristine blanket of white. When we finally reached the top, we disembarked and looked around. The station was as we had expected, derelict and abandoned, with broken windows and a roof sagging under the weight of snow. The interior was dark and cold, the air filled with the smell of mildew and decay. We briefly explored the station, noting the old control panels and rusty machinery, but the sense of foreboding was palpable. As we prepared to ski down, the weather took a turn for the worse. The wind howled, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Snow began to fall heavily, reducing visibility and turning the landscape into a ghostly white blur. We hesitated for a moment, but our eagerness to experience the descent overpowered our better judgment. We set off, navigating the narrow, winding trail that descended from the lift station. The snow was deep and powdery, the terrain challenging but exhilarating. The trail led through a dense forest, the trees heavy with snow and their branches forming dark, twisted silhouettes against the white backdrop. As we skied deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew increasingly eerie. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches creaking and groaning in the wind. The snow muffled all sound, creating an oppressive silence that was only occasionally broken by the distant howl of the wind. Suddenly, we came across something unsettling. An old, weathered sign partially buried in the snow. It was barely legible, but through the accumulation of ice and grime, we could make out a warning. Danger, do not enter. It was odd, given that the area had been advertised as part of the backcountry experience. We shrugged it off as an old relic, a remnant of a bygone era. The descent became increasingly treacherous. The snow had turned to a heavy, wet sludge, making it difficult to maintain control. We struggled to navigate the narrowing trail, our skis slipping and sliding on the uneven surface. The forest seemed to darken, the shadows lengthening as the snow continued to fall. Then we saw it, a large, dark shape lying across the trail. It was partially buried in snow, and as we approached, we realized with horror that it was a body. The figure was clad in old ski gear, frozen and twisted in an unnatural position. The sight was chilling, and we could see the skeletal remains of someone who had clearly been there for a long time. The discovery was horrifying, and we quickly backed away, our hearts racing. We realized that we were in serious trouble. The trail was becoming more difficult to navigate, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. We turned to leave, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. The trees formed a labyrinth of dark, oppressive shapes. The sense of panic grew as we struggled to find our way back. The storm had reduced visibility to almost nothing, and the trail was nearly impassable. Every turn seemed to lead us deeper into the forest, the snow swirling around us and obscuring our path. At one point, we stumbled upon an old, collapsed structure, an abandoned maintenance shed, its walls sagging and its roof caved in. We took shelter inside, hoping to wait out the storm. The shed was dark and cold, its interior filled with old tools and equipment covered in dust and cobwebs. The atmosphere was suffocating, the silence broken only by the howling wind outside. As we huddled together, trying to stay warm, we heard something that made our blood run cold. The sound of footsteps outside, crunching through the snow. We tensed, listening intently, but the footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, and we felt a growing sense of dread. We waited for what felt like hours, the storm raging outside. The footsteps never returned, but the sense of unease remained. Eventually, the storm subsided, and we decided to venture back out, hoping to find our way to safety. The return journey was harrowing. The snow had piled up, covering the trail and making it nearly impossible to find our way. We moved slowly, carefully, our movements clumsy and exhausted. The sense of being watched never left us, and every rustle of the wind or snap of a twig made us jump. By the time we reached the lodge, it was dark, and we were physically and emotionally drained. We told the resort staff about our experience, but their reactions were strangely indifferent. They offered no explanation for the body we had found or the warning sign we had seen. We left the resort the next day, our sense of relief palpable. The drive back to civilization was quiet, our minds occupied with the haunting memories of the previous day. We never spoke of it again, but the image of the frozen body and the eerie silence of the forest lingered to this day. I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. The abandoned ski lift, the warning sign, and the body in the snow. It all seemed like a sinister puzzle that we were never meant to solve. Every winter, when I see snow-covered peaks and old ski lifts, I'm reminded of that chilling encounter. I can't help but wonder what other dark secrets lie hidden in the frozen wilderness. The ski trip had started out as a dream come true, a chance to escape the grind of everyday life and immerse ourselves in the untouched beauty of a remote, uncharted mountain range. My friends Jenna, Mark, and I had planned it meticulously, choosing a trail that promised pristine snow and breathtaking views. The sort of adventure you tell stories about, with just enough risk to make it exciting. The first few days had been everything we hoped for. We skied through powdery expanses, our only company the distant cries of birds and the whisper of the wind through the pines. The snow was deep, the air crisp, and the isolation felt refreshing. We were experienced enough to handle the terrain and cautious enough to avoid danger. Then came the fourth day. We decided to explore a new area that had caught our eye on the map. It was a remote section of the mountain, marked by a series of winding trails that led into a dense forest. The map hinted at an old, abandoned ski lodge somewhere along the way, something that intrigued us more than anything. We were eager for a bit of exploration and the thrill of discovery. As we set off that morning, the weather seemed perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and a sun that warmed the snow underfoot. We followed a trail that led us deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us. The serenity of the woods was almost surreal, the air quiet except for the crunch of our skis and the occasional rustle of wildlife. After a few hours of skiing, we came across what looked like an old path, overgrown and barely visible. It was different from the well-groomed trails we had been on, but it seemed to head in the right direction. We followed it, curiosity driving us forward. The path twisted and turned, eventually opening up into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood the old lodge. It was a dilapidated structure, half buried in snow, its windows boarded up and its wood siding rotting. It looked like something out of a ghost story, a relic from a bygone era. We approached cautiously, our excitement mingling with a sense of unease. The lodge was eerily quiet, the only sound our breathing and the soft crunch of snow. Mark was the first to reach the front door, which hung ajar on its hinges. He pushed it open, and a cloud of dust puffed out into the cold air. "Hello," he called into the darkness. His voice echoed faintly. "Is anyone here?" No response. We entered the lodge, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The interior was even more unsettling than the exterior. The walls were covered in yellowed wallpaper, peeling and curling at the edges. Broken furniture lay scattered around, old chairs with tattered upholstery, a rotting sofa, and a long bar covered in a thick layer of grime. We moved through the lodge, exploring each room with a mix of fascination and apprehension. The air inside was heavy, stagnant, and smelled faintly of mildew. It was clear that the lodge had been abandoned for a long time. In the back room, we found something that made our blood run cold. A series of old photographs pinned to a corkboard. They were black and white, depicting scenes of the lodge and its heyday. People skiing, laughing around a fire, families enjoying winter holidays. But as we looked closer, we noticed something disturbing in the background of several photos. Figures standing in the shadows, their faces obscured, watching the camera. "Hey, check this out," Jenna said, her voice tinged with unease. She pointed to one of the photographs. In it, a dark figure stood behind a group of skiers. His presence was almost imperceptible. "Creepy," Mark said, trying to laugh it off, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's probably just some old photos with shadows or something." We continued our exploration, moving to the second floor. The stairs creaked ominously under our weight. The second floor was even worse. A maze of empty rooms with broken furniture and cobwebs. The sense of abandonment was more intense here. The air was colder, as if the building itself was exhaling a chill. In one of the rooms we found a large mirror. Its surface was cracked and grimy, but when we looked into it, we noticed something strange. The reflection of the room seemed off, distorted, as if the mirror was showing a different reality, a twisted version of the room we were in. We laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling creeping up our spines. After exploring for a while, we decided it was time to head back. The lodge had been fascinating but also unsettling, and the fading light outside reminded us that we needed to return to our cabin before dark. We gathered our things and started back toward the entrance. As we made our way down the stairs, Jenna suddenly stopped. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Guys, I think I heard something," she whispered. We stopped, listening intently. At first, all we could hear was the creaking of the old building, but then we heard it. A faint rhythmic thumping sound, like footsteps. They seemed to come from the floor above us. "Probably just the building settling," Mark said, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice was shaky. We started to head back up, but as we reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped abruptly. We stood there frozen, our breaths visible in the cold air. The lodge was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. "Let's get out of here," Jenna said urgently. We hurried back down to the main floor, our steps quick and uneasy. The sense of urgency grew with every passing second, the thumping sound still echoing in our minds. We reached the front door and pushed it open. The cold air hit us like a wall. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snow. We left the lodge behind, skiing quickly back toward our cabin. The forest seemed darker, the trees more forbidding, as we moved through the twilight. That night, as we sat around the cabin, the unease didn't leave us. We tried to laugh it off, recounting our adventure, but the atmosphere was tense. None of us slept well, each of us haunted by the feeling of being watched, the strange sounds in the lodge, and the unsettling photographs. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave early. We didn't want to spend another night in the cabin, let alone go back to the lodge. We packed our gear and left without a word. The eerie silence of the forest wrapped around us as we skied away. As we drove back to civilization, we talked about the trip, trying to piece together what had happened. The lodge had been unsettling, but none of us could explain why it had felt so wrong. The photographs, the strange sounds, none of it made sense. We never went back. The mountain remained a mystery, a dark memory that we shared but never spoke of. Every now and then, I think about the lodge, about the figures in the photographs, and the feeling of being watched. The sense of dread lingers like an aftertaste that never quite fades. It's been years since that trip, but sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, I still hear the thumping sound, like footsteps following me through the darkness. And I wonder, what was watching us in that old lodge? What was hiding in the shadows, waiting for us to leave? The lodge stands there still, somewhere in the forest, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. And every time I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that it's still waiting, still watching, and still hiding something that we were never meant to find. This trip was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance for my wife, Emily, and me to reconnect and unwind. We had booked a stay at a secluded lodge nestled deep in the Rockies, far from the bustling ski resorts and crowded slopes. It promised solitude and an escape from everyday life. What we didn't anticipate was how this trip would turn into a nightmare. We arrived on a crisp December afternoon, the sun low on the horizon and casting long shadows across the pristine snow. The lodge was exactly as we had hoped, charming and rustic with a warm, inviting interior. The owners, an older couple, greeted us warmly and showed us to our cozy room with a view of the snow-covered mountains. The first day was idyllic. We spent it skiing on the trails surrounding the lodge. The snow was perfect, and the air invigorating. The lodge itself was a haven of comfort, with a crackling fire in the hearth and hearty meals prepared by the owners. Everything seemed perfect. By the second day, we decided to venture off the beaten path, exploring some of the lesser-known trails that branched off from the main slopes. We had been told by the lodge owners that these trails were less frequented but perfectly safe. We were experienced skiers, so we felt confident venturing out on our own. We set off early, the snow crisp under our skis and the sky clear and bright. As we moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, their branches heavy with snow. The sense of isolation was palpable, but it was a welcome change from the crowds we had left behind. After a few hours of skiing, we came across an old, abandoned cabin tucked away in the forest. It was partially buried in snow, its windows dark and forbidding. The sight of it was intriguing, and Emily suggested we check it out. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. We approached the cabin, our footsteps crunching loudly in the quiet snow. The cabin door was ajar, creaking softly as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty and cold. The interior was a mess of broken furniture, scattered debris, and old, rotting furniture. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, but there was something unsettling about it. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere that made my skin crawl. We explored the cabin, finding nothing of particular interest except for a large, faded map pinned to the wall. It depicted the area around the lodge and the trails, but there were markings on the map that we didn't recognize. Strange symbols and cryptic annotations. As we examined the map, we heard a sudden loud noise from outside. A crash followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Emily jumped, her face pale with fear. We quickly left the cabin, our hearts pounding. Outside, the snow was falling heavily, obscuring our view. We scanned the area but saw nothing out of the ordinary. We decided it was best to head back to the lodge, the eerie atmosphere of the cabin still lingering in our minds. As we made our way through the forest, the snow began to fall harder, reducing visibility to near zero. We turned back several times to ensure we were still on the right path. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. Eventually, we stumbled upon a strange sight, a set of fresh tracks in the snow leading away from the path we had been following. The tracks were large, deep, and oddly shaped, as if something massive had been moving through the snow. Emily was visibly shaken, and I couldn't deny that the tracks unnerved me. We followed them for a short distance, but the snow was falling so heavily that they soon became obscured. We decided to return to the lodge, our sense of unease growing with each step. When we arrived back at the lodge, the owners greeted us with a look of concern. They asked if we had seen anything unusual, but we brushed it off, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. The warmth of the lodge and the comforting presence of the owners helped us forget the unsettling experience, at least for a while. That night, the storm intensified. The wind howled outside, and the snow battered against the windows. We huddled by the fire, trying to relax, but sleep eluded us. Every creak of the old lodge seemed amplified, and the howling wind outside created a constant backdrop of eerie noise. Around midnight, we heard a loud thud coming from outside, followed by a series of scraping sounds. It was as if something was trying to get inside. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and peered through the window, but the snowstorm had reduced visibility to almost nothing. I saw nothing but swirling white. I woke Emily, and we both listened, trying to discern the source of the sounds. The scraping continued, accompanied by an occasional thud. We decided to check the outside of the lodge, but the storm made it nearly impossible to see anything. We put on our coats and ventured outside. The snow quickly accumulated around us. The wind was fierce, and the snow stung our faces as we trudged around the lodge. We found nothing unusual, just the storm and the dark, silent forest. Back inside, we tried to calm our nerves, but the sounds continued intermittently throughout the night. We stayed awake, our minds racing with fears of what could be out there. The atmosphere was thick with dread, the storm adding to the sense of isolation and vulnerability. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of fresh snow. The world outside was pristine and eerily quiet. We checked around the lodge, but there were no signs of disturbance. The tracks we had seen the previous day were now covered, and the lodge appeared untouched. Despite the lack of evidence, the feeling of unease lingered. We decided to cut our trip short, packing our things and leaving the lodge as quickly as we could. The drive back to town was tense, the sense of being watched never quite leaving us. As we left the mountain, I glanced back at the lodge, now a distant silhouette against the snowy landscape. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking in the forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered on that trip. The cabin, the strange tracks, the eerie noises, they all remain a chilling mystery. Whenever I think back to that trip, I remember the feeling of being watched, the sense of impending doom, and the strange, unexplained occurrences that made our otherwise perfect vacation a terrifying experience. Every now and then, when the wind howls and the snow falls heavily, I hear the faintest scraping sound, like nails on metal. It's a haunting reminder of the isolation and fear we faced, and a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. The ski trip was supposed to be a break from the mundane. My husband Mike and I had always enjoyed our winter getaways, but this time we wanted something different. We found a small, isolated cabin in the mountains, far from the usual resorts and crowds. It was a rustic, charming place that promised solitude and a unique experience, the kind of trip where you could truly disconnect from the world. The first day was perfect. We arrived at the cabin, a weathered structure with a steep roof and large windows, just as the sun was setting. The sky was a brilliant orange, and the snow-covered landscape was bathed in a serene glow. The cabin was even better than we had hoped, cozy, with a crackling fireplace and a view that stretched out over miles of untouched snow. As night fell, we settled in with a bottle of wine and a few board games, enjoying the peace and quiet. The wind howled outside, but inside we felt warm and secure. It was exactly the escape we needed. The second day, we set out to explore the surrounding area. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by dense, dark forest. We followed a narrow path that led deeper into the woods, marveling at the snow-covered trees and the silence of the forest. It was as if the snow had muffled all sound, creating a blanket of eerie stillness. We found a small stream, its water frozen solid. As we walked along its banks, Mike pointed out animal tracks in the snow, large, oddly shaped prints that seemed out of place. We shrugged it off, attributing it to the wild creatures that roam these remote parts. That evening, as we were preparing dinner, the power flickered and then went out completely. It wasn't a surprise. We were in a remote location with unreliable utility lines. We lit some candles and continued with our meal, though the flickering light and growing darkness gave the cabin a slightly unsettling atmosphere. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, Mike noticed something strange. a faint scratching sound coming from outside. It was rhythmic and persistent, like something was clawing at the door or the walls. I dismissed it as the wind or the settling of the cabin, but Mike wasn't so sure. The sound continued throughout the night, growing louder and more insistent. I struggled to sleep, my mind racing with all sorts of unsettling thoughts. By morning, the scratching had stopped, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. We decided to venture out and investigate, hoping to clear our minds. The snow had drifted overnight, leaving a pristine layer over everything. As we walked through the forest, we noticed something unusual. Large, deep gouges in the snow, leading away from the cabin. They seemed to form a rough path, and they were far too large and irregular to be from any animal we knew of. Mike followed the tracks, his expression growing more troubled with each step. The path led us deeper into the forest, twisting and turning. The trees were dense, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It felt as though we were being watched, though we saw nothing but the dark, silent woods. Eventually, we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. A small, dilapidated shed, half buried in snow. It was hidden among the trees, almost camouflaged by the surrounding foliage. The door was ajar, hanging loosely on one hinge. We exchanged uneasy glances but decided to check it out. Inside, the shed was cluttered with old tools, broken furniture, and strange discarded objects. There were old, rusted cans and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. But what caught our attention were the walls, covered in strange markings and symbols etched into the wood. They were crude, indecipherable, and disturbing, giving the shed an ominous, foreboding feeling. We left quickly, our unease growing as we made our way back to the cabin. The forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The sense of being watched returned, more intense than before. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig seemed amplified, as if something or someone was following us. Back at the cabin, we tried to brush off the experience, but the sense of dread lingered. That night, the scratching sounds returned, louder and more frantic than before. We tried to ignore it, but the noise was impossible to escape. It was as if something was desperately trying to get in. We both hardly slept, jumping at every sound. The following morning, we found that the snow around the cabin had been disturbed. The large gouges from the previous day were now accompanied by deep, irregular holes, as if something had been clawing at the ground. Mike was visibly shaken. He wanted to leave immediately, but we were several hours from the nearest town, and the snow had made the roads nearly impassable. We decided to wait until morning, hoping that whatever was out there would leave us alone. That night, the scratching reached a fever pitch. It was relentless, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. We barricaded the door with furniture, though it felt like a futile gesture. The fear was palpable, the air thick with tension. We held each other, our hearts racing as the sounds continued. At one point, we heard a loud crash from outside, followed by an eerie silence. We peered through the windows, but the snow had begun to fall heavily, obscuring our view. We could see nothing but a wall of white. The storm intensified, but brought no relief. The snow had covered the gouges and tracks, erasing any evidence of the night's events. The cabin was silent now, but the feeling of dread had not lifted. We packed our belongings quickly, eager to leave the isolation of the cabin behind. As we drove away, the storm continued to rage, the snow heavy and unrelenting. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees casting dark, twisted shadows. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. The drive back to civilization was fraught with tension. We couldn't stop talking about what had happened, trying to make sense of it all. The strange symbols, the scratching, the disturbing tracks, they were like pieces of a puzzle we couldn't quite fit together. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced at that cabin. The isolated shed, the symbols, the relentless scratching. It all remains a haunting mystery. We never returned to that place, and though the memory fades, the feeling of being watched never quite leaves me. Every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear the faintest scratching sound, like nails on wood. It's a chilling reminder of the isolation and fear we faced, and a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed.